The sun over Long Beach in August of 1964 did not merely shine, it baked the pavement of the coastal city, sending shimmers of heat rising from the parking lots surrounding the municipal auditorium. Inside, the air was trapped, thick with the scent of floor wax, starch, and the collective perspiration of over 500 martial artists who had gathered for the International Karate Championships. It was a cavernous space, yet it felt claustrophobic, crowded by the immense weight of tradition. The men in the stands and on the floor were the architects of the American martial arts scene, men who had spent decades in the rigid, uncompromising disciplines of Japanese and Okinawan karate, Korean Tang Sudo, and various styles of Kempo. Their uniforms, the heavy white cotton GIs, were pressed and sharp, snapping like whips whenever they moved through their pre-arranged forms. To these practitioners, the martial arts were a cathedral of geometry and hierarchy. You moved when you were told, you struck at the prescribed angle, and you honored the lineage of masters that stretched back through centuries of silence and discipline. There was a profound sense of order in the room, a shared understanding that the way things were done was the only way they could ever be done. When Bruce Lee walked onto the center of the matted floor, he didn't just disrupt that order, he seemed to exist entirely outside of it. He was 23 years old, possessing a physique that was lean and corded with functional muscle. But he didn't carry himself with the stiff, upright posture of the karateka. He moved with a loose, predatory grace, his shoulders relaxed and his weight shifting fluidly from one foot to the other. He wasn't wearing a traditional jai. Instead, he wore a dark, short-sleeved kung fu jacket and long trousers, an outfit that felt more like the attire of a street fighter than a tournament competitor. As he stood under the hum of the overhead lights, 500 pairs of eyes, many belonging to men who had killed in combat or spent 40 years punching wooden posts, fixed on him with a cold, analytical skepticism. They saw a young man who looked far too comfortable in a place that demanded formality. They saw a rebel who hadn't yet been humbled by the reality of their hard styles. Bruce reached for the microphone, and the sound of his voice cutting through the hall was the first real shock to the system. He didn't offer a long ceremonial bow to the officials or the portraits of the founders. He spoke with a rapid-fire intensity, his English sharp and rhythmic. He didn't talk about the spiritual piece of the dojo. He looked out at the rows of masters, many of whom were twice his age, and told them that the way they trained was a classical mess. He watched the faces in the front rows, men with scarred knuckles and thick calloused hands, as he explained that their rigid stances were nothing but shackles. He used the phrase "swimming on dry land" to describe their katas and their shadow boxing, arguing that they were practicing a dance while convinced they were learning to survive. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. It was the kind of silence that exists between a spark and an explosion. You could see the vein in a master's neck throb as Bruce called their cherished traditions organized despair, arguing that they were teaching students to react to a world that didn't exist. To demonstrate his point, Bruce called Bob Baker forward. Baker was a seasoned martial artist, significantly taller and broader than Bruce, a man who understood how to take a hit. Bruce didn't drop into a deep horse stance or prepare his breathing with a loud shout. He stood casually, his right foot slightly led, his body seemingly at rest. He placed his fist just 1 inch from Baker's chest, the knuckles barely grazing the fabric of the man's uniform. From the bleachers, it looked like a static, powerless position. There was no room for a wind-up, no space to generate momentum. But Bruce wasn't relying on the swing of his arm. He began the movement in his lead foot, gripping the mat with his toes. That force traveled up through his calf, snapping his hip forward in a microscopic, violent rotation. The kinetic energy surged through his core and out through his shoulder, which stayed down and relaxed until the final microsecond of impact. The sound of the punch wasn't a crack, but a deep, resonant thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Baker's body didn't just recoil, it was launched. His feet left the mat as his center of gravity was obliterated. He flew backwards several feet, his back hitting a chair that had been placed for safety, and the momentum was so great that he and the chair continued to slide across the floor until they struck the rear wall. Baker sat there gasping, his eyes wide as he tried to process how a 1-inch movement had felt like being hit by a sledgehammer. The demonstration of speed followed, and it was even more unsettling for the observers. Bruce asked for another volunteer, telling the man to block a direct punch to the face. Bruce stood at a distance that seemed fair, then announced exactly when he would strike. Despite the warning, Bruce's hand would blur into motion and stop a fraction of an inch from the man's nose, before the volunteer's hands had even left his waist. He did this repeatedly, each time faster than the last, his knuckles appearing like ghosts in the man's field of vision. He was moving with a twitch response that felt alien to the karate practitioners, who were used to the 1-2 rhythm of block and counter. Bruce wasn't blocking, he was simply being there before the other man could react. As he finished and walked off the mat, he didn't look for approval. He looked like a man who had just performed a necessary surgery on a dying patient. The atmosphere backstage was no longer one of professional interest. It was one of pure, unadulterated hostility. As Bruce walked toward the dressing areas, the hallways seemed to narrow. Groups of black belts stood in his path, their arms crossed, their eyes burning with a desire to prove him wrong. They felt that by calling their arts dryland swimming, he had spat on their entire lives. One particular master, a man of formidable reputation, stepped forward and blocked the way. He didn't ask for a demonstration. He challenged Bruce to step into a back room, away from the cameras and the crowds, where they could see if his gung fu worked when someone was trying to break his jaw. Bruce didn't hesitate. He stepped closer, his breathing unhurried, and told the man that he didn't fight for points or trophies, and if they went into that room, there wouldn't be any rules to save him. The tension was broken only by Ed Parker, the tournament's host, who sensed that a riot was brewing. Parker used his considerable influence to usher Bruce away, but the message had been sent. Bruce Lee was no longer just an outsider. He was an enemy of the establishment. The months that followed were a slow boil. The traditionalists in the San Francisco and Oakland areas, particularly within the powerful Chinese martial arts community, could not let the Long Beach insult stand. To them, Bruce was not only disrespectful to karate, but he was also a traitor to the secret, guarded nature of Chinese gung fu by teaching it to non-Chinese students. A formal challenge was eventually drafted, a scroll signed by the leading figures of the Chinatown schools. They sent their best fighter, a master of Northern Shaolin named Wong Jack Man. The terms were absolute. If Bruce lost the fight, he would close his school in Oakland and cease teaching forever. Bruce accepted without a moment's pause. He didn't want a public spectacle this time. He wanted to end the debate once and for all. The fight took place in Bruce's small private studio in Oakland. The room was sparse, lit by the grey light of a Northern California afternoon. There were no mats, just the hard, unforgiving floor. Only a handful of people were present. Bruce's pregnant wife, Linda, and a few representatives from the Chinatown faction, who stood along the wall like statues. There was no bowing, no warming up. When the signal was given, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Bruce didn't wait. He exploded forward with a series of straight, rapid-fire punches, his feet scuffing against the floor as he sought to overwhelm Wong Jack Man immediately. Wong, however, was not the stationary target Bruce had encountered in his demonstrations. He was a master of movement, using long, flowing steps to circle Bruce, his palms held out in a defensive posture that utilized his superior reach. The sound in the room was the heavy rhythmic breathing of two men in a life-or-death struggle, punctuated by the occasional slap of skin on skin. Bruce's knuckles caught Wong across the cheek, but the blow lacked the finishing power Bruce expected. Wong countered with a sweeping kick that Bruce narrowly avoided by springing backward. The fight quickly devolved from a technical exchange into something raw and desperate. Bruce was frustrated. He was landing 3 punches for every one he took, but Wong was elusive, constantly turning and retreating, forcing Bruce to chase him around the cramped studio. They collided near a wall, and for a moment, the fight turned into a grappling match. You could hear the grunts of exertion as they jockeyed for position, their muscles straining against one another. Bruce managed to break the clinch and land a heavy strike to Wong's chest, but his own breathing was becoming ragged. The physical exertion of a real, unscripted fight was different from the controlled bursts of energy he used in training. His lungs felt like they were filled with hot lead. Sweat blinded his eyes, and the floor, now slick with the moisture of their struggle, became a hazard. He found himself slipping as he tried to plant his feet for a power shot. Wong Jack Man attempted to use the momentum of Bruce's aggression against him, trying to trip him or push him off balance. At one point, Bruce swung a heavy hook that missed, and the force of the empty swing nearly pulled him to the ground. It was an ugly, grueling spectacle. There was no cinematic beauty here. There was only the sound of two men hitting bone and gasping for air. After nearly 3 minutes of relentless chasing and striking, Bruce finally managed to corner Wong. He used a series of low kicks to trap the other man's legs, then drove him to the floor. Bruce was on top of him in an instant, his weight pinning Wong down as he began to rain down punches. "Do you give up?" Bruce shouted, his voice hoarse. "Do you give up?" Wong Jack Man, unable to move and exhausted by the pace Bruce had forced upon him, finally nodded his head. The representatives from Chinatown stepped forward to end the match. The fight was over. Bruce had won. He had defended his school and his right to teach. But as the outsiders filed out of the studio, Bruce didn't stand up and cheer. He slumped against the wall, his chest heaving, his face bruised and his knuckles raw and bleeding. He looked at his hands, which were shaking from the adrenaline and the fatigue. Linda approached him, but he stayed silent for a long time. The win didn't feel like a win. To the world, he had proven his superiority. But to himself, he had failed. He had been in the center of the circle for 3 minutes. In his mind, a true master should have ended it in seconds. He realized that the dry land swimming he had mocked at Long Beach was something he was still doing. His Wing Chun was a system of close-range fighting, but in the chaos of a real struggle, it had failed to provide him with the tools to handle a moving, retreating opponent without exhausting himself. He realized that by following the style of Wing Chun, he had limited his own potential. That afternoon, in the quiet, dim light of his Oakland studio, as the heavy wooden door finally clicked shut and the last of the challengers disappeared into the hazy California streets, the Long Beach insult finally came full circle. Bruce did not stand in the center of the room like a triumphant gladiator. Instead, he slumped onto a wooden bench, his chest still heaving with a shallow, ragged rhythm that he couldn't seem to steady. His knuckles were raw, the skin split and weeping from the impact of repeated strikes against a moving target, and his muscles felt as though they had been infused with hot lead. This was the reality of combat that the 500 black belts at the International Karate Championships had never discussed. In that silent room, the air still thick with the metallic scent of sweat and the dust kicked up from the scuffle, Bruce realized that while he had been right to criticize the traditionalists, he had been profoundly wrong about himself. He had walked onto that stage in Long Beach and mocked the dry land swimmers. Yet when faced with a man who refused to stand still and play by the rules of a choreographed exchange, Bruce had felt his own limbs grow heavy and his own techniques turn clumsy. He understood in that moment of physical exhaustion that a fight is not a ritual, nor is it a performance of technical perfection. It is a total, unscripted event that demands a total, unscripted human being. This realization was the crucible in which Jeet Kune Do was truly born. It was not birthed as a new set of fancy techniques or a more efficient way to kick. It was born as a philosophy of ruthless subtraction. Bruce began to look at his own training with the same cold, analytical eye he had used to judge the masters in Long Beach. He sat in his library, surrounded by thousands of books on anatomy, kinesiology, and the history of combat, and began the process of shedding everything that was useless. He realized that the human body has limitations and strengths that don't care about the name of a style or the color of a belt. He began to study the footwork of Muhammad Ali, watching grainy reels of the heavyweight champion moving like a fencer on a canvas ring. He saw how Ali used distance and timing not just to avoid being hit, but to set up a psychological trap for his opponent. Bruce started to dissect the precision of Olympic fencers, realizing that the stop hit, the act of striking an opponent at the very moment they intend to strike you, was the highest form of combat. He looked at the leverage used by wrestlers and the direct punishing efficiency of Western boxers. He took his Wing Chun apart, piece by piece, throwing away the flowery hand movements and the rigid, narrow stances that had hindered his mobility in the fight against Wong Jack Man. He became a scientist of human motion, obsessed with finding the most direct path between 2 points. He would spend hours practicing a single punch, not to make it look beautiful, but to remove the telegraphing, the small, involuntary movements of the shoulder or hip that warned an opponent a strike was coming. He wanted to be a man who could strike with the suddenness of a snake, without warning or preparation. He stripped away the unnecessary tradition that had choked the life out of the martial arts for centuries. He stopped caring about the way things were supposed to be done and started caring only about what worked in the heat of a chaotic struggle. This evolution was his true response to the 500 masters who had wanted him gone. They had clung to their styles like life rafts in a changing ocean, but Bruce decided to learn how to swim in the current itself. The 500 masters at Long Beach never truly forgave him for the mirror he had held up to their faces. For the rest of his short, meteoric life, Bruce Lee remained a pariah to the traditional martial arts establishment. To them, he was a heretic who had broken the sacred seal of silence and disrespected the lineage of the elders. They wrote scathing articles in martial arts magazines, attacking his character and questioning his credentials. They forbade their students from mentioning his name in their dojos, treating him like a ghost that could be exorcised if only they ignored him long enough. They sat in their rigid stances and waited for him to fail, waited for his theatrical style to be exposed as a fraud. But Bruce had moved beyond the need for their validation. He no longer cared about their hierarchy, their belts, or their honorary titles. He had learned that the most dangerous person in the world is not the one who has mastered 1,000 forms or memorized the history of every kata, but the one who has mastered himself and is willing to throw away every scrap of knowledge he possesses in order to find what is objectively true. He had walked into that Long Beach auditorium in 1964 as a cocky kid with a chip on his shoulder and something to prove to the world, but he left that era as a man who would eventually redefine how the entire world understood the concept of human strength. The real lesson of Long Beach was never found in the mechanics of the 1-inch punch or the blurred speed of his strikes that the cameras couldn't capture. It was found later, in the heavy silence of his Oakland studio, where he decided that he would rather be like water, fluid, formless, and capable of adapting to any container, than be a stone carved in the image of a dead master. He realized that a stone, no matter how hard, can be broken, but you cannot hurt water. You cannot stab it. You cannot kick it, and it will always find the crack to flow through.